HS2 Limited say that they're making up for the environmental impact of the project, delivering many miles of ecological and landscape investments. But we've checked the maths. The plans for nature don't add up. The company in charge has made some very serious mistakes. Our audit reveals mistakes, serious mapping errors, and outdated, flawed accounting. Far more nature will be lost than we've all been told. The detail behind HS2 Limited's calculations has not been made public, but the consequences will be devastating. HS2 Limited has not been held accountable until now. We are sending our evidence to the government. Will you come on board? The government must make HS2 Limited remap, recalculate and rethink, and put an immediate pause on HS2.
Hello and good evening and welcome to Wildlife from the Wildlife Trusts for February, just about February 2023. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for what I know is going to be one of our more heated discussions around the topic of HS2. Now, why do I say that? Well, because let's face it, over 10, 15, 20 years, and I've seen it from a lot of different angles, HS2 has proved to be a really difficult issue for environmental organisations in this country. You know, for many decades, environmental organisations, the green groups, have argued for investment in sustainable transport. And broadly, that means putting local transport, cycling and walking ahead of then longer distance transport like railways, but that very definitely ahead of road building. And we've had a long hatred really in the environmental movement of road building over many years. And so when proposals first came along for HS2, a new high-speed line up the west coast of England, of course environmental groups wanted to look favourably on it. And first off, environmental groups came together to talk about how it could be done well in a way that would deliver on sustainability. But as time has gone by, you've seen more and more concerns arise about how HS2 has been done in practice. And actually that's caused a lot of the environmental movement in this country to turn against HS2. But there are still many people who really care about sustainability and who support HS2. And they would cite for that reason as well. It is an issue that has caused real challenges and divisions at times within the environment community in this country. And I think it's a really fascinating topic to explore, not just for HS2 in its own right, but because actually, if we win in our mission for greater sustainability and investment in sustainable infrastructure, maybe our debates around what kind of infrastructure we want need to move from just an in-principle debate to how we do it in practice. And it's the same whether we're talking offshore wind, whether we're talking about other forms of sustainable transport, or so many other issues we could think about, energy infrastructure and many others besides. Is it enough to support something in principle, or do we actually have to get looking in detail at how things are done in practice? We've got an absolutely cracking panel pulled together for you tonight to help look at this topic, and we've had over 250 questions from you in advance to put to that panel. So we'll get to those as soon as we can. But tonight, please do make sure you're commenting in the chat as we go along on YouTube. Tell us where you're joining us from. Tell us what you think. You can make comments or you can put questions to the panel and we'll try and get through as many as possible. Now, we know you like our polls that we do on Wildlife. And so we wanted to start tonight with a poll, actually, even before I introduce you to the panel. So the first poll tonight is, do you think green groups should support HS2? Simple question, yes or no, or not sure. Do you think green groups should support HS2? Yes, no, or not sure. Let us know, and it'd be very interesting to see what the results are. We've had many people on all sides of the debate joining us tonight for this really important discussion. Anyway, so hopefully that poll is appearing now and you'll be able to vote as soon as possible. We'd love to see those results. In the meantime, I'm going to introduce you to our fantastic panel tonight. We have Rachel Giles, who's Evidence and Planning Manager at Cheshire Wildlife Trust. I'll say a bit more about Rachel as we get into it. We've got Adam Cormack, who's Head of Campaigning at the Woodland Trust. We've got Phil Sturgeon, who's Chair at Protect Earth and a voluntary spokesperson for Greens4HS2. We've got Estelle Bailey, Chief Executive of Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust, or BBOUT, as is known to many people. And we've got David Oakes, actor, nature podcaster and ambassador for the Wildlife Trusts and the Woodland Trusts. You get two for the price of one tonight, David. It's a good one. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, I want to say before we get into it, we did invite HS2 Limited to take part in this debate tonight. We invited Mark Thurston, Chief Executive of HS2, and Eileen Thompson, Director of Communications and Stakeholder Management at HS2 Limited, and both declined the invitation in favour of a private meeting with the Wildlife Trust, which, well, of course, we will do. And we've had many of those meetings in the past as well. But of course, we will meet with HS2 again to set out our most recent concerns. But we want you to know that we did invite HS2 Limited to take part and be part of the panel. I have to say, therefore, we're very grateful to Phil Sturgeon for coming into what is perhaps the lion's den and arguing in favour of HS2 tonight. But Phil, we're really grateful for you doing that, and we hope it will open up the conversation on that. And we'll try and be very nice to you, Phil. We'll try and do that. Absolutely. I think it's very important for us to be having this conversation. So let's kick off though tonight to hear from our first panelist, who's going to be Rachel Giles. As said, Rachel is Evidence and Planning Manager at Cheshire Wildlife Trust, where she's worked for over 12 years. And Rachel led the team of many people that put a lot of work into the Wildlife Trust's most recent report into HS2, which was called HS2 Double Jeopardy: How the UK's largest infrastructure project undervalued nature and overvalued its compensation measures. Rachel's done a lot of work on HS2, including providing oral evidence on the progress and impact of HS2 to the House of Commons Transport Committee, based on the findings of the report. And Rachel has worked with Natural England to help shape the government's biodiversity metric, and has delivered professional training on the use of that metric through the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environment Management. So Rachel, to kick us off tonight, please, if you can, please give us the context around the report. Why did we at the Wildlife Trust decide it was important to produce this report, and what does the report tell us?
Yeah, well, we were asked to do this report by the Wildlife Trust. Obviously, there's a lot of background in terms of HS2 and all the consultation responses and all the asks that the Wildlife Trust has put to HS2. One of the really big issues was the lack of transparency. So we'd been asking HS2 to essentially publish their biodiversity no net loss metrics. So these are the figures that HS2 are essentially communicating to a wide audience, including the government, about how close they're getting to achieving no net loss of biodiversity. But the issue was, and has been for us, that all the background information hadn't been released, and we were asking for this for 4 years. So this is essentially the background. So when it was released, and we at the Cheshire Wildlife Trust were asking for it, when it was released, we wanted to check those figures essentially. And this is what we did. We set out to independently calculate the impacts of HS2 on biodiversity. And then once we've done that, we wanted to compare our results to those of HS2. We used exactly the same methodology, so theoretically the results should be the same. And yeah, essentially we were asked to do this because the Cheshire Wildlife Trust were quite good at measuring biodiversity, so we've got quite a lot of expertise. I've got a great team working on it. So I had Andrea, and I've got to shout them out because I know I've been asked a lot about this, but yes, Andrea, Amelia, Ross, Laura and Heather have been working on this really hard for over a year. So so yeah, we wanted to be very objective in the way we were assessing biodiversity, and we wanted to be accurate in the way we portrayed the results as well.
Great, Rachel, thank you very much. Can you tell us a little bit more about the process that your team went through when looking at the data? How did what's the process you went through to produce this report?
Well, we did two things. The first thing that we did was to map all the habitats and assess and evaluate all the habitats in the pathway of HS2. And this is between London and Crewe. And because that was the only data that HS2 had released, that we've been asking them for 4 years for. And we evaluated those habitats. So, for example, I mean, there is a way of doing this, and it's quite, rigorous. That the way that we do it at the Cheshire Wildlife Trust. So, if you've got an area of woodland that's full of bluebells, say it's 300 years old, and it's got tawny owls and foxes, and that you compare that area of woodland to another area of woodland that's essentially newly planted woodland, 20 years old, then obviously your older, well-established woodland is going to get a higher value. So we did that. We mapped every single habitat in the path of the and then the second thing we did is to take a tool that HS2 used called the biodiversity metric calculator tool, and we use their methodology to calculate the impacts, so how much nature is going back. And it's the difference between the two, so how much nature was there before compared to how much nature HS2 are putting back. So that's what we did, and we replicated what HS2 had done. So theoretically our results should have been the same as HS2's results.
Great, thank you. Rachel, we've already had questions coming in. One from Pete Johnson. Johnson. Your report reevaluated the biodiversity of the before HS2 state, but then just compared that with HS2's assessment of the after HS2 state. Pete asks, isn't that comparing apples with pears? I'm getting.
Yes, so we used HS2's figures to measure the amount of biodiversity that's going to be put back in, because if we'd done it a different way, we would have had to probably spent another 3 years doing this assessment, because obviously it's going to take a long time. But the reason we did that is essentially we wanted to use their tool, and we wanted to replicate what HS2 had done. So we did amend their figures. We didn't take them straight as they published them, because we found when we looked at them, there were mistakes. So for example, HS2 had given pre-development buildings didn't get a value, but post-development, HS2 had actually given the built environment, so buildings, a biodiversity value. So unless they're actually going to put green roofs on those buildings, right, it was an inconsistency. So we corrected inconsistencies and we corrected obvious errors, but essentially we were using their measurement of biodiversity going back in. However, we did do a little bit of research around that tool that they were using, and a lot of the report discusses the shortcomings of that tool. So I don't know if maybe people watching this are aware that there is this biodiversity government metric to measure biodiversity that's been 10 years in development, and this is the standard tool that certainly all developments under the Town and Country Planning Act are using at the moment, and developments coming forward will have to use this tool. But HS2 are not using this tool. They're using a version of this tool that's 10 years out of date, essentially. So it's a version of the tool based upon the pilot. And it's also been amended for use by HS2 to make it easier for them to use for a long linear infrastructure project. So yes, I agree with the premise of the question. We essentially used their tool to look at the amount of biodiversity going back. And this is why we say very, very clearly, our assessment is not definitive. We're not saying that our results are correct at all by any stretch of the imagination, because what we really want to happen is that HS2 use another tool to measure biodiversity, to not use our results, go back, redo it all again. And we found massive differences, we're 7.9 times more biodiversity loss on phase 1 compared to what HS2 is saying, 3.6 times on phase 2A. So we want them to go back and essentially we want them to remap all the habitats, because mapping is pretty rubbish, to be absolutely truthful. It's quite atrocious in terms of the accuracy. We're a very small charity, our mapping is a lot better than ours, thanks to my very hardworking team. But we found lots and lots of errors. So field margins weren't measured properly.
Sure.
Yeah.
So really what you're saying is we just got to get to the truth, whatever it is. Yeah, absolutely. All right, Rachel, thank you very much. Been very useful to hear that. We have actually a video that was produced by Cheshire Wildlife Trust to explain this in a little bit more detail. Let's have a look.
So I've travelled today to a site just south of Crewe to look at the impact that HS2 would have on the ground if it was built in a few years' time. And I'm meeting up with Dr. Rachel Giles, who's the lead author of the Wildlife Trust review into HS2's nature calculations. You've said that you found quite a few errors with the mapping up and down the line. Was that the case here at this site?
Yes, it was. So all this grassland that we can see here, this tall tusky grassland, HS2 had actually mapped it as an arable field, so a maize field.
Right.
They'd also made a mistake with this drain next to us here.
Okay.
They hadn't valued that. And this drain is really important because this is where we've got a waterfowl population.
The waterfowls are really struggling, aren't they,
Yeah,
in the UK?
yeah, they are at the point of extinction in Cheshire, so we are very worried, particularly about this population. So HS2 do know the waterfowl are here, but what they didn't calculate or they didn't value was the water body itself, so the drain that they live in. They actually mapped this as a hedge.
Wow,
Yeah.
I mean, it's clearly not a hedge,
It's not a hedge
by anybody's definition, is it? So that's really serious then. So we've got a really endangered species living on this habitat here, and actually HS2 have completely missed that.
Essentially, our results showed 7.9 times more biodiversity loss than HS2 for phase 1, so that's the bit between London and Birmingham.
Yeah.
And then for phase 2, so between Birmingham and Crewe, we found 3.6 times more biodiversity loss, so a massive difference.
Yes, so why does that matter then?
It matters because obviously that's what HS2 are communicating. They're trying to demonstrate that there'll be no net loss of biodiversity as a result of the scheme, but in reality we've found it's quite a different story. So this is why it matters. They're not going to be putting enough wildlife back in order to compensate for the impacts.
So what do you want HS2 Limited to do?
Well, we want them to recalculate. They need to go back and do the mapping again because we found it's really inaccurate. They've made lots of mistakes. And then the second thing that we want them to do is to use a different way of calculating the impacts. They're using their own methodology and it is fundamentally flawed, so we're asking them to use a standard methodology.
It's really important that a scheme of this scale gets its calculations right and that nature doesn't ultimately lose out in the end, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. We need to get it right. This is the biggest infrastructure project in Europe. We should not be making these mistakes.
Great, thank you very much to Cheshire Wildlife Trust for that video that really kind of makes it clear. We've had some great comments coming in. One from Jonathan Gatwood said, "Hi all, here from Yorkshire. Very interested in the geospatial aspects of wildlife assessment. I'm a professional geographer doing a lot with habitat mapping and biodiversity net gain." Well, Jonathan, I'm a geographer as well, and geographers are the best. We can just say that. And it's really only on Wildlife that you get wonderful phrases like geospatial aspects of wildlife assessment. So Jonathan, delighted you could join us tonight, and I hope we're already starting to answer some of those questions. You really cheered me up using that phrase. Anyway, we put the poll to you before about whether green groups, do you think green groups should support HS2? Guess what? We've had 12% of you said yes, 60% said no, 26% said not sure. So I think, that kind of does show, the level of debate still within the environment community around this. So thanks so much for taking part in that poll. Very interesting, and strongly held views on all sides of the debate, of course, on this. So we go to our next guest now, Adam Cormack, from the Head of Campaigning at the Woodland Trust. Adam, great you could join us tonight. Thank you very much. Adam is, as I said, Head of Campaigning at the Woodland Trust, where he leads a team working on ancient tree and woodland protection, urban trees and campaigns. So let's kick off, Adam. What is the Woodland Trust stance on HS2?
Well, Craig, we followed HS2 through from the first environment statement published in 2013 to the present day. And really, put simply, what we've been trying to do is reduce the damage and destruction of HS2 on woods and trees, and especially ancient woodland and ancient veteran trees. So those are the sort of most valuable, oldest wooded habitats. And fundamentally, that's what we've been trying to do, and doing a range of different things. We've appeared at select committees and given evidence on the damage. We've done some public engagement and community work. We've engaged with HS2. We have regular meetings with them, and we've tried to influence some of the decisions on the design of HS2 so that it can avoid damage to woods and trees. And I guess you could take that back to a position of being opposed to the route, if you like, not the principle of high-speed rail. And, I think, I like trains. I use public transport as often as I can in my life, really, because I understand that it's part of trying to have a low carbon economy. But I think, as we'll probably find out over the course of the next hour and a half, the early stage planning on HS2 led to a lot, we're still clearing that up a decade later, really, in terms of some of the decisions and some of the damage it has caused to ancient woods and trees.
Thanks, Adam. And so tell us a bit more. What actions have the Woodland Trust undertaken to influence HS2 over that time, and what successes are being met with, if any?
So, as I said, we've done a lot of different things. So we have appeared at the select committees and given evidence. We've been a petitioner, so trying to be a voice for woods and trees through the sort of formal processes around HS2. So that means giving evidence in Parliament and explaining about the damage to ancient woodland. We've done some public engagement and work with communities affected along the route in the early stages. So we meet regularly with HS2 as well, and we have an undertaking, which is that HS2 contact us every time there's works within 100 metres of an ancient woodland. So that's involved a lot of to and fro over the years in terms of giving advice and trying to work with HS2 to minimise that damage. So the big question, has any of that worked? Well, last year HS2 brought in an ancient woodland reporting process. So that's something that we'd been pushing for a long, long time. So the second one of those reports was published in November of last year, and that indicated that, according to HS2, the amount of ancient woodland affected on phase 1 had reduced by about a third. So it gone down from, I think it's around 29 hectares to 20. So it is not perfect. There's still woodlands and trees being damaged, but I hope that, the work we're doing is having an impact in terms of reducing the damage that happens. And, looking back in the early stages of HS2, we had proposals for things like temporary works to enable the construction of the railway sited on ancient woodlands. We talk about temporary, like areas for construction on irreplaceable habitats. It's fundamentally wrong. And I do think there's been a growing awareness that that is the wrong way to do major infrastructure projects. The challenge now is taking that forward into government policy, and that's something that the Woodland Trust will be trying to do.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Adam, we've had a huge number of questions, even before we started tonight. There was one from Gary Hunt, said, is there a tipping point where the damage already done by the development means that it's preferable to finish the whole line in its truncated form? And if so, are we there yet?
Oof, good question. Well, so in terms of phase 1, most of the felling of ancient woodlands has been done now. So in terms of what you have to play for is not the right word, but what you're trying to fight for really in terms of ancient woodland protection, most of those woods have been felled now. Obviously, as I said, we've been working with HS2 at times. So this is a balancing act about trying to challenge and fight damaging proposals whilst trying to influence them at the same time. So, HS2 have shown it is possible to reduce the amount of ancient woodland affected by the proposals. We've seen that in their reports. You know, everyone will draw that line in a different place, Craig. And I think that's probably one of the things we'll find today. You know, right now, as we talk, there are huge tunnel boring machines going under the Chilterns, aren't there, kind of creating this railway. So, you know, it's pretty far progressed, particularly on phase one. There is still a lot to be done, obviously, with phase, you know, because this is a phase project. You know, there's a lot to campaign for and push for in terms of further reductions on phase 2A and particularly on phase 2B. And on phase 2B, you know, I just want to give one example before we move on. So the whole Heath to Manchester Airport section, 11 direct impacts to ancient woodland. Passenger travelling along that stretch of line is going to cross a directly impacted area of ancient woodland every 12 seconds. Rewind back to 2013 and 14 when the route options were looked at, only one of those 11 ancient woodlands was identified in the early plans from HS2. That's the problem.
So for you, there's big lessons here, presumably for other future infrastructure projects as well, not just HS2.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, my sort of perception of how this is sort of now sort of taking place is I think there's been an evolution in understanding across almost everybody involved with the project, really. Challenge is to take that forward into government policy now, as well as obviously influencing the future stages of HS2. Soon government's going to be consulting on its national networks, national policy statements. This is the policy that guides major off-road and rail projects coming up really, really soon. Like, you know, I think it's next month. You know, we've got to get avoidance of of irreplaceable habitats into that policy so that it becomes a fundamental way of how we design major infrastructure projects.
Great, Adam, thank you very much. Really good to have you with us tonight. So we're going to move on to the next guest now, who's that brave soul I introduced earlier, Phil Sturgeon, Chair at Protect Earth and voluntary spokesperson for Greens4HS2. Phil, thanks very much for joining us tonight and obviously offering a different side of the debate. Very important, particularly given HS2 declined to join us. Tell us, first of all, a little bit about Greens4HS2. You're a group that want to change the Green Party's policy on HS2. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. At the moment, the Green Party are the only political party not supporting HS2 in some form. And we, very strangely, we have a very jumbled transportation policy. We support a high-speed rail running north to south in principle, but we don't support HS2 in practice, which is a little bit of a funny situation to be in. So yeah, we're just trying to help point out the benefits, and also point out that it's possible to want HS2 to be built as a project whilst also holding HS2 Limited, responsible for what they're doing, much like the Woodland Trust and Wildlife Trust are doing. So the work that Adam was talking about has been fantastic. We're glad that you're there, giving them a hard time, making sure they're avoiding ancient woodlands whenever possible. And we've all been cheering about getting the phase 1 damage to ancient woodland down by 30%. So we want all those same things.
Okay, tell us a little bit more, Phil, about then the work you've been doing over the years on this, and you know how practically you've gone about the campaign.
Greens4HS2, there's a whole bunch of folks that could probably talk to you about some of the history better. I've only been around for a couple of years, but they've been influencing all sorts of policies. They've been making sure that the car parks at some of the stations are a little bit smaller, so you know, there's less people driving to the station, because that doesn't really help get emissions down. Making sure that the trains will have you know, space for bicycles on there, so we've got more active transportation happening. There's a whole bunch of stuff they've been doing. Yeah.
And Phil, you said before in your opening answer, you said that the Green Party's position is to sort of support HS2 in principle, but not in practice. And you said that's a sort of strange position to have. What's your view? Where's the tipping point? Because I put the same sort of a similar question to Adam just now. For you, where's the tipping point as to how bad it would have to get before you support opposing it in practice, supporting in principle, but actually opposing in practice?
Yeah, I mean, how bad it's getting, I think, needs to be put into some context against other road infrastructure projects. I mean, we need sustainable transportation. The Wildlife Trust themselves have said that, you know, you've got loads of sites that are being risked with fires, floods, you know, rivers drying up, all sorts of problems are happening. So we absolutely have to get emissions down by all costs, essentially. And so we need to ask ourselves, is losing 0.006% of our ancient woodland an acceptable loss in order to get a far more capacity on our rail network, which would allow us to get rid of domestic flights in this country, get cars off the road, get freight onto rail and other things like that. So I think at some point people are going to have to reflect on their view. There's a lot of people who've been anti for a very long time, but as Adam said, kind of 99% of the ancient woodland that's going to be felled for phase 1 has been felled. So even if you were against it in the future, like at some point you're going to have to come around to supporting that high-speed rail, right? I mean, I'm in the morning jumping on HS2 and I'm going to that's the Channel Tunnel link, and I'm going to Amsterdam instead of flying, which is fantastic. I think we'd all agree that that's the right choice to make. And at the time, a lot of people were against HS2, but now it exists. We all support it. And so at some point, HS2 will be built, whether it's done in full to release the amount of capacity that we really need, or done partially, which is a huge loss. At some point we'll be using it. Unless we want to sit around kind of boycotting this train that exists, we will be supporting it. So it's just a question for when will Greens support it, not if.
Maybe, Phil. I don't know. I know plenty of people that supported it to start with and ended up against it as well. So I think it kind of goes both ways. But thank you very much for joining us. And a lot of the points you've raised there are things I'm sure we're going to get into more detail. We do have a video from Greens for HS2 that I think sets out your position. Let's have a look.
We are in a climate and ecological emergency. Climate change is killing British wildlife. We need to hugely reduce our use of roads, cars and planes to protect nature and reduce emissions. To do this, we have to increase the capacity of our rail network. Domestic transport is the highest emitting sector in the UK, and terrifyingly, emissions aren't falling. For middle and long distances, electric rail is best. It has the lowest emissions, energy and resource use. Cars and roads take more land away from nature. The Eurostar trains on HS2 can carry more passengers than the M2, but take up a fraction of the space. We need more rail capacity. How does HS2 provide this? Currently in the UK, fast intercity trains in red and slower local trains and freight in blue are on the same tracks and getting in each other's way. HS2 means that the fast trains from 3 main lines, West Coast, Midlands and East Coast main lines, can be segregated onto their own tracks. We get 3 railways for the price of 1.5. The fast trains can bunch up and more services can be run, reducing domestic flights. This frees up bottlenecks and means that more local and slower services can be run on our existing rail network, serving local communities and getting lorries off the roads. If the HS2 eastern leg from Birmingham to Leeds stays cancelled, HS2 would only free up capacity on 1 main line, the West Coast main line, instead of 3. This is still useful, but it hugely reduces the benefits and only slightly reduces the costs. Any habitat loss is horrible, and like all net zero infrastructure, HS2 unfortunately comes with ecological costs. The HS2 tunnel is minimising ancient woodland loss in the Chilterns. Improving and widening existing railways, such as London to Aylesbury, would mean more disruption and more habitat loss, including ancient woodland. Let's focus campaigning on stopping road expansion nationwide. Let's hold HS2 Limited to account to minimise ecosystem damage, restore nature and share their data. Let's campaign for other railway lines to be built and reopened, from East West Rail to Northern Powerhouse Rail. Thank you for listening.
So that was the video from Greens for HS2. Thanks so much for that. Just to throw it into the debate today, and you can see that, you know, there's heartfelt passions on all sides of this debate. But if what we want is heartfelt, let's now go to hear from Estelle Bailey, Chief Executive of Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust. And as Chief Executive of that trust, of course, HS2 has already cut right across Estelle's patch. Estelle, great that you're able to join us tonight. Thanks so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit more about the history of your trust with HS2 and how it's been impacting on the 3 counties that you operate in.
Well, thanks, Craig, for having me on tonight. It's lovely to come on. It's it's a debate that needs to be had, actually, as we've heard from both sides now. So great to be part of that. So thank you very much. Well, look, I mean, we're on the front line of it, and you talked a little bit about passion there, and it's something that we feel so deeply, deeply about. And we've had a long connection to HS2, so we've been in court twice with this now. We challenged around the strategic environmental assessment and the lack of it, and we made some wins there. So we've been right in the game from the very beginning of this with HS2, challenging to make sure that nature, biodiversity was taken into account when they were planning it. And, you know, it's just not worked out that way. Let's be honest, you know, we're all in favour of, you know, better transport connections, and, you know, we're not anti-development, and I'd stress that. And the Wildlife Trust aren't, but it's the way that it's done. And I think the way that this has been planned right from the very beginning has been done very, very poorly. And we're seeing the results of that now on the ground. You know, we're talking about the ancient woodlands being felled. You know, it's so raw. The emotional response here is so raw. And for BBOWs, we've had, well, it impacts 2 of our nature reserves, Calvert Jubilee, being this beautiful wetland site, lots of scrubby habitat, great for bitten, all sorts of rare butterflies. And about 1/3 of that now has been taken, lost to the bulldozer overnight. You know, they started work without our consent, and that's been lost. Another nature reserve.
Estelle, just tell us a little bit more about that. So it was compulsory purchased off you, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. We had very little say in it. Yeah, so it went to compulsory purchase, and literally
1/3 of the reserve, yeah.
1/3 of the reserve, yeah, and literally sort of overnight the bulldozers moved in, and it was just mud. Absolutely, you know, everything that had been there, you know, beautiful woodlands and scrubby areas, completely gone. You know, we had masked people wandering around the site, security guards, you know, frightening visitors to the site. Nobody knew what was going on. It was absolute chaos, and it was just really, really poor communication on their behalf. But, you know, it's a fantastic site that's been lost forever. That's not going to come back, and no matter what level of compensation goes in, that site is lost, and a site that's held very dear to local people. And I think that, you know, this is a big part of it. You know, we're on the front line and dealing with the emotional responses day to day of local people who are seeing habitats cleared, you know, houses cleared, farms gone, bang, bang, bang. And what's coming back? And I think it's just not clear of the plan to restore nature behind it. There's nothing obvious that's coming in. And that's our major concern. It's, you know, it's all very well putting in developments, but yeah, but what's going to happen to nature and wildlife in that?
So you think that it could have been done differently? Actually, how it's been executed in practice has been bad, both in terms of sort of on the ground, but the communication around it as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I say, we're not anti-development, and we would have quite happily worked with HS2 from the very beginning to influence the way that the scheme is being delivered. And we have had some wins. You know, we did go to court. We've influenced an awful lot for different species and bats and barn owls, and trying to get tunnelling changed and all sorts of different things. So we've had some really good wins. So we've been able to influence on many levels. But I think if we were to start from scratch again, we would have liked to have really worked with HS2 to influence the route, to make sure that any damage was limited as far as possible, but then nature was really fully accounted for in the process. But as we've heard from Rachel, you know, the metric that was used and the kind of special dispensation, if you like, that was given to HS2, you know, it was wrong, actually fundamentally wrong. And we should stop, we should pause, and we should really start to think about this, because it's not actually too late. We know it's going to go ahead. The development is going to happen. It's happening already, but it's not too late just to stop and really think about the way that the calculations are being implemented. You know, we now know they're not right, so we've got to stop and actually do something about that.
Yeah, and there's obviously this point also about communications. I mean, it is a shocking story that they turned up on the site unannounced, no warning one day. You had members walking around, Wildlife Trust members of the public walking around at this nature reserve that they love, and the first that anyone knew was they turn up with their bulldozers, no warning.
Yeah, no, absolutely, no warning at all. And it was really scary. And I went down to kind of see firsthand what was going on, was met by security guards. And, you know, it was really intimidating. And, you know, you have absolutely no say in this. And I guess now that they have the law in their hands in a different way, you know, you're not allowed to kind of trespass on any HS2 land at all now, so without threat of being arrested. So, you know, we can't even go out and you know, protest peacefully now. That has been taken away from us. So, and like I say, it's really difficult being on the very, very front line of it. And, you know, BBOUT, like every other wildlife trust, we've been, you know, we're place-based. We've been around since 1959 protecting, you know, these sorts of places. So to see it destroyed in front of us, it's absolutely heartbreaking.
So your view is, you know, whether you're for or against HS2, you know, surely we can agree it shouldn't be done in the way that you experienced at Calvert Jubilee.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this one thing that HS2 should learn from this is really to improve their communications. And still now we're fighting over compensation. And the way that the land has been valued, obviously they compulsory purchased the site, and you would expect some financial compensation for that. And it turns out we're actually going to get very little, because the way that the land is valued, it's not of agricultural grade, so therefore doesn't command the same price, you know, the book price, go to open market. It's hardly got any value according to HS2 because of what it is. So, you know, they're not seeing, obviously, that nature has a massive value. It underpins our economy, our prosperity, absolutely everything, let alone our well-being, and there for nature's sake. So to have that taken away with no compensation for that, no recognition, you know, that's pretty heartbreaking.
Would it be enough compensation for BBOUT to be able to buy an equivalent size reserve elsewhere in your patch?
No. I mean, the price of land these days is, you know, it's absolutely astonishing, and particularly down here in the southeast. So no, we couldn't. And there's another nature reserve just up the road which HS2 is going to be impacting as well, and that was actually bought with Heritage Lottery Fund money. So there's a great big slice of that. And it seems that HLF may want to recoup that money off us. So we could be in a kind of loss-loss situation here where, you know, we're losing land, we're losing nature, and we're losing money and not getting compensated, but having to hand it back. So it's a bit perverse, really.
Goodness, well, Estelle, really sad to hear that. Although, you know, I went around the site with you about a year or so back, and it really was shocking to see. We actually have a video from BBOUT now to show the impact on the Calvert Jubilee Reserve. So let's have a look at what Estelle's been talking about.
I'm over at Calvert this morning, so lovely sunny day, but really depressing news that HS2 have finally taken possession of part of our Calvert Jubilee Nature Reserve. Known the site for so many years, having grown up locally as a boy. It's really where I got to know nature, and yeah, got that first taste of a nature reserve, watching badgers and ducks from the main bird hide. So yeah, really depressing and saddening from my point of view that HS2 have finally come in, and as you can hear in the background, the whir of chainsaws and brush cutters where they establish their new perimeter boundary, and yeah, we lose part of one of our real kind of gems of a nature reserve. Such a sad day.
Fymere Woods is an amazing example of a remnant woodland habitat of this area. It's got some amazing wildlife here: purple emperors, white admiral, and Bechstein bats, which is probably one of the UK's rarest bats living here in the woods and roosting nearby. There's a lot to lose here, and we have to challenge the assumptions of
HS2 and the destruction that that will cause potentially through this area. Part of the reserve has actually been purchased, compulsory purchased for the purpose of HS2. So you can see that the impact will be completely devastating around this area. Stuff that we cannot afford to lose nationally, because that's it. When it's gone, it's gone. You can't compensate for this stuff. You can't pick up ancient woodlands and ponds and move them. People have to understand that it is not an option, and we've got to stop this now.
There we are, shocking scenes from Calvert Jubilee Reserve there and the impact HS2 has already had on it. So we're going to move now to our final panelist, and I'm delighted to say we're joined tonight by actor and podcaster David Oakes, who's graced our screens in fantastic period dramas like Victoria, and obviously also the Netflix shows Vikings Valhalla. When he's not on set or treading the boards, he's out walking in a glorious wild place, talking to experts about the natural world and celebrating it in his podcast, Trees a Crowd. And as I said earlier, David is an ambassador for the Wildlife Trust, but also the Woodland Trust. So we're giving you extra value tonight, David, as you join both of us. David, tell us, what are your thoughts on everything you've heard tonight from sort of both aspects of the panel, if you like?
How long have you got, Craig? It's an interesting one. I think ultimately the stance that Phil's making about HS2 being completed in full is the strongest case for HS2, which is that the promise of a massive thumping railway service that can hopefully decarbonize our country and help transport and freight move around more easily, people and freight more easily, is a good thing. But it's very clear that that is not going to happen. So it all boils down to essentially what is HS2. Because we're obviously going to lose wildlife loss. We know that we're going to lose more than HS2 are saying that we're going to lose, based around what Cheshire have done up with their assessment of the no net loss metric. And yet you've got HS2 simultaneously sort of talking about creating a carbon neutral railway, but they also say by their own records that it's going to create, I think after 2B, 3 million tonnes of CO2, which will take at least 120 years to get off the balance sheet. And also, if we're trying to make the country carbon neutral, why does the current plans for HS2 have a leg that doesn't go through one but through 11 ancient woodlands to Manchester Airport? Because surely we shouldn't be making us more reliant upon air travel, because that's only going to push up those carbon credentials that they're saying that HS2 doesn't possess. So it's that thing. I don't know what HS2 is anymore. Where does it go? Because it doesn't go through that stretch of Sir Graham Brady's constituency anymore. That went the other day. And we've lost, possibly, I don't know what's going on with leg 2B, and that might be gone, and we're going to end up with this white elephant that serves a bit of the country and in not the way that it was initially planned to. The Greens4HS2 is saying, obviously, if we could have both stretches completed in full, then yeah, there's an opportunity to have a full freight line running up and down that would hopefully help in some way, but then we'll need a whole load of freight detraining areas and trucks to take things from localized areas going elsewhere. It's very hard to talk about a project that doesn't seem to know what it is anymore. A project that has relied upon NGOs and wildlife organizations to stand up and fight every single second of the way to stop them doing as much damage as they've already done. And that's kind of where I am. I'm in principle fundamentally behind rail transportation in this country. Especially if our people who run those trains are on strike, I'm behind that. But it needs to be done in such a way that it benefits us, because the current plans for HS2 do not benefit the wildlife. We know that, that's clear. But the current plans for HS2 don't really seem to benefit the people in its current form. And Lord knows where it will be in a year's time. Will it run to Euston? It certainly won't run to Euston for another 5-6 years. And so, yeah, you've got a quick rail link from Birmingham down to northwest London, and not many people want to go there unless, well, I won't finish my sentence. There you go. Sorry, northwest London.
David, we had a question from Keith Metcalf, who said, I'm going to quote it to you just because he said he's just finished watching David in Valhalla too. So there you are. I was obviously enjoying you in Valhalla. He says if London and the South is ever going to rid itself of the North-South divide, maybe HS2 is the primary option. As a conservationist, and I hate to ask this question, are humans more important than wildlife?
Well, is that are humans more important than wildlife? Yeah, the compulsory purchase orders have prioritized humans over barn owls and badgers by making them homeless instead of going through the nice constituencies of Conservative voters. But I think ultimately, yeah, a way to break the North-South divide is, to use the awful phrase, is to level up and trying to make people move around more, make their money move around more. But this rail network in its current form doesn't help that. It doesn't go far enough. It's not going to link up to Leeds, which, I mean, we spent a lot of time on Victoria filming in Leeds and Harrogate, all around Yorkshire. I've worked in York and other projects. I've worked up in Edinburgh. I've moved around the entire country on rail networks for my entire professional career. I've been blessed with good transport and have also stood from Manchester to Bournemouth on occasions. There's a whole load that's right and a whole load that's wrong with that network. But in terms of trying to make a network that can help break that North-South divide, this may have been it in the early planning stages, but it certainly isn't now. Even Andy Burnham, the Labour mayor for Manchester, who was very pro HS2, now has publicly stated that he would much rather support the Northern Powerhouse rail over HS2. So, I mean, if the North don't believe in this project and they're supposedly the ones that are going to benefit from it, you're not hiding to nothing.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? It's originally kind of, I think the promises sort of 25 years ago was the idea you could get on a train in Glasgow and get off in Berlin. But the fact that HS2 won't even connect to HS1 raises questions for me. And it's interesting how the debate has sort of shifted from one, in the early days, it was all about speed, and now it's very much supposedly about capacity. So these are all issues that we're going to get into in this discussion. But David, I was saying before that you've been involved in this podcast, of course, hosting a podcast, Trees a Crowd. And for the March episode, you were interviewing Chris Packham on HS2. Let's have a little listen for the episode of your podcast coming up soon in March.
We as campaigners, protesters, whoever we are, need to stop and think, our methods, are they working? Well, I would argue that they're not working. People take to the streets, they peacefully demonstrate, they glue themselves to things, they throw soup over things, they chain themselves above motorway gantries, they gather news under extremely difficult circumstances when it comes to keeping these issues in the public eye. Some of them are loathed for doing that because of people's short-sightedness, and also because they take an affront to their methods, but they do that before they actually consider their motives. Mm-hmm. And I mean, I support, Just Stop Oil and so on and so forth, because, I'm compelled to think about their motives. These are people who are terrified of the future, and they're terrified of not being heard, and they're struggling for a voice in a media which is overcrowded with distractions, all sorts of nonsense going on all the time, there to keep our eyes off of the bigger issues which are impacting our lives and our planet.
Do you think it's working?
No.
So
they still commission the coal mine.
Well,
they haven't stopped HS2.
Well, then the question is then, at what point does a very high-profile television conservationist like yourself do something that's not peaceful protest?
That's a very good question.
So there you are, fantastic panel tonight as we move into the Q&A, and keep those questions coming in. There's loads of them coming in and loads of comments as well. First of all, let's have a look at some of these comments. Rob Stoneman is on a train moving from Edinburgh South down to York. He said it's quite fast enough, we just need trains to be more reliable with better broadband. Oh, Rob, I agree with you on that. Every time I'm on a train and the broadband is rubbish, drives me mad. Expensive, nothing like HS2. So that raises a question, doesn't it? Is it speed we need, or is it actually comfort and reliability of the sort of services on board? I'm, for one, a bit of a fan of sleeper trains, as it happens. Choosy Susie says, no, it's not a green project, quite the opposite. I see the devastation around me every day in Buckinghamshire. Emma R has said, I feel the money put into HS2 could have been better spent investing in current rail infrastructure, encouraging more people to use it and likely taking cars off the road. Dave G has said, all that money would be better off going into improving local public transport. Getting to Euston in 3 hours is quick enough for me. But then again, Robbie Mack has said, topic is very tricky. I support the idea in principle. After the Wildlife Trust report, I'm not sure. I want to know the response from HS2 Limited and the ecologists who worked on the mitigation plans. And Martin Lowe has said, all these resources the Wildlife Trust put into scrutinising rail project when there's thousands more miles of road development that barely get a second look. Well, Martin, I would say Wildlife Trust, we put a huge amount of effort into scrutinising road developments as well, right across the country, everything from the Norwich Relief Road, the M4 bypass as well down in Gwent, across the Gwent levels that we ran a huge campaign against many years ago and successfully won. And of course, we worked hard to try and get the Welsh Government to foot behind their current ban, really, their proposal to stop all road building unless there's very clear environmental assessment in the context of climate change in support of it. So we at the Wildlife Trust do a lot of work against new roads where they will cause harm to wildlife, for sure. But those comments just give you a sense of some of the topics on that. Phil, let's come back to you. I know you wanted to respond to some of the things that have been said, and one of the things I'm interested to come to first of all, this we have seen the arguments for HS2 evolve over the years. You know, they started off as, I mean, David was talking about this. Started off this promise that it could connect up right through to Europe and so on. That it was all about speed, and now people very rarely talk about the speed. They talk about capacity, but of course also it won't connect through to HS2 anyway. What's your kind of sense of all that? You know, it is clearly the case that the arguments have changed a bit over the years.
Yeah, I think historic marketing and explanations were poor. I think some of the earliest kind of reports I've read have always been talking about capacity, but it's got speed in the name and people get caught up on slogans and things like that. But the speed is only really important when you're trying to entice people away from aeroplanes. That's the main reason that speed might be relevant. But it's not, I mean, you always hear people talking about 20 minutes faster to Birmingham, and that's just put that on the bingo card of silly rhetoric. It's really got nothing to do with the speed. You don't need to get a train that's slightly faster. Really, it's all about, as you saw in the video, moving the fast services onto their own dedicated lines so they're not constantly pushing other trains out of the way. And so you don't want your speed of your train to come at the cost of other people having more trains. We want more trains on the existing network, and that means more reliable trains. You aren't getting pushed out of the way and delayed while a fast whooshy train flies through to some other city. So there will be more local and regional rail available, and because that also means that, you know, the existing intercity services are being pushed onto their own line, and there's a lot more local services available. You now have more seats available, and the basic supply and demand kicks in. You can actually have you know, not just more rail, but cheaper rail. Right now, if we massively increased subsidies, right? If we took subsidies away from planes and started giving people cheap rail tickets, they wouldn't fit on the rail. They wouldn't be able to get in those trains. We're already back to pre-pandemic levels. All the work from home stuff hasn't helped with the demand. So we're using price to essentially, you know, regulate demand. If they're more expensive, less people use them. And so that means more people are pushed to flying and pushed to roads. And so it's brilliant to hear David bring up the point of emissions, because most people don't actually talk about emissions. The report that we're talking about and all of the discussions we've had tonight have been focused on kind of the local impact of the footprint of the line, which is literally always going to be destructive. Like you can't send in bulldozers and not have destruction. That line will look bleak. All construction sites do. But the point is, if we don't have rail, we are supporting the status quo, which is lots of cars, lots of airport expansions. And that leads to biodiversity loss in other ways. You've got, you know, more roadkill from RIS2. You've got, you know, more people.
Phil, explain what RIS2 is. Not everyone will necessarily know that acronym.
Yeah, that's kind of a funny topic for me, because RIS2 is the Road Investment Scheme 2. It's 25 billion pounds being spent on 4,000 miles of road. So road obviously always increases emissions. Even once we've switched to electric vehicles, it's only going to put emissions up. We get all the pollution from tires breaking down. And so the pollution being caused by roads in this country is horrendous. But because HS2 is a single project, it's much easier for everybody to kind of focus on fighting that. While unfortunately, a lot of the pushback against RIS2 as a whole is left to smaller groups who don't have the capacity to fight against these roads. So, for example, one of the 50 schemes in RIS2 is Lower Thames Crossing. That's 6.5 hectares of ancient woodland being lost for 14 miles of road. But a lot of people seem to spend a lot more time talking about the electric train that can bring emissions down massively, and not in 120 years. That statistic has been knocking around for a really long time, and it's literally never been true. In order for 120 years to be the carbon payoff point, you'd have to have a 0.1% reduction in cars and planes, which is not how it is ever gone any other time high-speed rail has been implemented between cities that have flights.
So Phil, what do you as Greens for HS2, when do you believe HS2 will become carbon neutral?
That's a brilliant question, and it depends purely on policy. Who's in charge pulling the policy levers when the line is opened? So to give a really simple answer, you do the basic maths on because the construction of HS2, the entire construction is the same as 1 month of road use. So you can easily do some maths on how long it would take to pay off if 20% of cars were reduced or whatever else. It could be as quick as a year if you banned flights the day that it opened, right? It could be by 60 years, they're saying it will be minus 4.2 million tons, which, stacked up against RIS2 is they're on plus 30 million after the same 60 years. So it purely depends on what you're doing about banning flights, what you're doing about enticing people over from their cars.
Yeah, exactly. So Phil, I mean, I would just question it. Often it's kind of seen as the alternative. It's either HS2 or it's flights, for example. But I mean, surely there's an issue about constraining flights is not necessarily something related to HS2. I mean, we could ban domestic flights now, couldn't we, if we wanted to, and so on. And David's making a point that actually HS2, many respects, people critique HS2 now as it seems to become a way of getting to airports quicker.
Getting to an airport with sustainable transportation is one of the Green Party's transportation policies. You want to make sure that if somebody is going to take a flight, then they're not driving their car and taking up loads of space. At Bristol, we have loads and loads and loads of car parks all over Somerset that are entirely just for that airport. So getting a train out there would be brilliant. Most of these airports already have trains to them, so it's not going to change that. We know that when you implement high-speed rail all over Europe, all over Asia, you have between 20 to 80% reductions in those routes, right? London to Paris is 80% reduction in flying. So the evidence that we have is that flying reduces when you put high-speed rail in, and to suggest that it will go up is purely speculation.
Yeah, but Estelle, let me ask you. I mean, if we spent £100 billion on improving local transport across the country, improving walking and cycling routes, or indeed commuter trains, without causing the damage of that HS2 is involved, that would transform our transport, wouldn't it?
Oh, I would imagine so, but imagine what it would do for our nature, though, Craig. I mean, we are one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world, don't forget. And actually, it's really interesting listening to you, Phil, talk, because it kind of feels like this is death by 1,000 cuts somehow. We build roads, build railways, and all the rest of it. We need nature as much as it needs us, and it just kind of feels like that's not even coming into the conversation here for you. We cannot continue to lose nature at the rate we're doing at the moment. So we've got to stop and really rethink this stuff. And just on the carbon side of things, I mean, do those stats include embodied carbon? Because they probably do. I don't know. They probably don't.
Yep.
in which case it would be far more. So I think there's issues there. No, okay, so Rachel's saying no, they don't. But yes, Craig, I think if we were to take that level of investment and put it into existing, upgrading existing infrastructure, yeah, absolutely fantastic. Better still, put some into nature's recovery, and then we could all live a little bit better.
Okay, I'm going to come to David in a moment. Just before I do so, I do want to clarify. Essex Wildlife Trust has strongly opposed the Lower Thames crossing that Phil was talking about there, and has been encouraging the public on how to object to that project. This project threatens biodiversity loss, including water voles, rare insects and reptiles. So we strongly agree that the Lower Thames crossing should not be built. And Essex Wildlife Trust has recently highlighted a public consultation on the Lower Thames crossing, which just closed actually. Essex Wildlife Trust says they are fundamentally opposed to the Lower Thames crossing. I'm going to mention Jonathan again, Jonathan Gatwood, just because, I'm a geographer as well. And Jonathan has said, David, love your collection of maps behind you. And because I was going to comment on them as well. So this is obviously something that geographers has been seeing. David, what do you make of some of the things you've been hearing from Phil? Because it's kind of, you were in your points earlier on, you were saying, you can imagine you were saying, I would say, I think probably all of us on this panel were saying how much we love trains, really. We're not opposed to trains, and we'd love to be able to support investment in trains, but we find ourselves having real problems with HS2.
Well, I think if we bench Estelle's incredibly valid point about the loss of wildlife for a second, he says whilst he's talking with his Wildlife Trust hat on, there's so much about what Phil had said, which theoretically sounds lovely, but it's also going hand in hand with statements like, if we got rid of flights tomorrow, we could get back the carbon in a day. We're not going to get rid of flights tomorrow. We're also talking about a rail line that is going to be linked, but we're not talking about reducing road transport at the same time as building the railway line. We're increasing the road usage at the same time. He's also talking about more trains running more frequently on the two sets of lines, admittedly, but as everyone's very well aware, we're having a trouble staffing trains and respecting those staff at the moment. And if you travel on a train across the north of England, you might not get a driver because they're trying to train them up. The infrastructure of just getting the trains that we currently have running isn't working as well as we might hope. There are a lot of, say HS2 was built and it's wonderful and it works and it's cheap and everyone wants to use it, then yeah, great. But we then would need to have a government that would say, we've got this, now we can focus on the environment and now we can focus on wildlife because we've got this wonderful transport infrastructure going. But that's not how the last government worked, or the government before that, or potentially the next government that gets in. They don't fundamentally place the environment catastrophe that we're facing at primary position, let alone secondary or third. Like, I don't know where the environment currently sits. Cost of living should be right at the top, but they don't seem to care about that at the moment. So when it comes to talking about, well, we'll get the rail link in and then we'll have a government that focuses on making everything green, supported and bigger and better and more connected, that's just fundamentally not how I see the future going. And I don't see how that ideal future can balance out this huge natural catastrophe that is taking place, funded by taxpayers' money at the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah, but I think it's important to keep in mind that what you're describing is a Conservatives problem and not particularly a HS2 problem, right? I think if we have a government in place by the time HS2 opens up who doesn't care about the environment at all, we've got much bigger problems than the railway line.
Well, one question I would then pose to you is, do you believe that the Labour manifesto clearly states their green credentials front and centre? If they are the probable next government, I would suggest that perhaps they're not as green-centric in anything other than simply being not the current government. They are not primarily focused upon the environment. I mean, exactly. Maybe we can persuade Keir in the next couple of years to be so, and hopefully we shall do better. But at the moment, that promise of that green future that you're hoping for doesn't seem to be a realistic one.
There was a brilliant op-ed in The Guardian last week about how the Labour Party can dial up its thinking on nature. If you Google it, you might just see who wrote it. Or I might have had a help from colleague as well. I'm going to come to Adam in a minute with a question that I'll then come to all of you, but I'll come first to Adam on it. But just on your point now, I find it always striking to reflect that over the last decade, we've had both the position of both the Conservative and the Labour Party has been simultaneously to support the building of HS2 and support the building of a third runway at Heathrow Airport. So it's kind of interesting, I think, as to where those don't point, if you like. Adam, the question I want to put to you, and then I'll put to the whole panel, from Tom Beeston. HS2 could have been a great project. Unfortunately, it's been managed via a broken government system. This is kind of getting into the debate that Phil and David have just been talking about. Can the panel consider and suggest how we ensure that broken system at all levels and cross-party doesn't do the same thing? In other words, mean that we make these mistakes with other infrastructure projects in the future.
So I mentioned earlier that the government in England is due to consult on its national networks, national policy statement. So this is the underlying policy for the big stuff, big roads, big rail projects. And there are, some significant opportunities to influence the thinking of how these projects work. So as part of the prep for tonight, I went back and I reread HS2's original environment statement from 2013. The non-technical summary, so the first thing they point you towards, and I would really encourage people to go back and read it if you've got the time and the kind of inclination. It's very instructive, and there's a bit that I wanted to just quickly read out, and it's comparing the way it treats cultural heritage assets and the environment. So it says the project will not require the demolition of any grade 1 or grade 2 listed buildings, and designing the project, HS2 Limited's aim has been to avoid or reduce direct adverse impacts on heritage assets. Move down to the bit on the environment and it does not mention avoidance. It's all about mitigation from the get-go. And we have an opportunity to change that now. And it's about like first principles for these projects, avoiding the harm and destruction of nature. We've all talked, to build a railway, you have to clear out the stuff in the way, but there are design choices you have. And I think we've got the power to do these things differently and to kind of think about major infrastructure projects as major green infrastructure projects. Starts with a consultation that's just about to happen.
Rachel, this gets to the heart of what your report was really looking at, and the lessons we need to learn from this. I mean, obviously there's lessons for HS2 and whatever future construction there may or may not be around HS2. That's really important, which is why the Wildlife Trust are calling for a pause and rethink. But actually, as much as anything, there's things to learn for future infrastructure projects as well, Rachel. What about, so Tom's question then, can we suggest how to ensure that broken system is fixed to ensure that it doesn't happen with major infrastructure projects again in the future?
I think part of the issue is the timing. Going forward, obviously, it's, if the situation was different with biodiversity, and if we didn't have 1 in 7 species at the risk of extinction, if we were 10, 15 years down the line and we got our local nature recovery strategies and our local nature recovery networks identified, and we had this resilient ecological network that could cope with massive inputs in terms of road building or other infrastructure projects, then things might be different, the outcomes might be different. HS2 is unprecedented in its scale, and it's going to happen really quick. We think, I've worked out that its size, the footprint is the size of the city of Manchester. It's not only the largest infrastructure project in Europe, but it's one of the biggest in the world. It's absolutely enormous. And just going back to Adam's point, the things that it's impacting, 333 local wildlife sites directly impacted. We talk about ancient woodland. Okay, there's 30 odd hectares of ancient woodland going to be directly impacted, but there's 760 hectares of other woodland going to be impacted. So it's just getting it in scale. This project is 77 times bigger than Crossrail. It's 66 times bigger than Hinkley C. This is absolutely enormous, and our wildlife can't cope with it at the moment. It's our ecosystems are fragile, they're fragmented, they're going to be fragmented even more when we have this long linear scheme going through them. This is a real issue going forward, and I think for other infrastructure projects in the future, I'd certainly like to highlight something I'm sure, Craig, you'll be familiar with the Dasgupta review published in 2021, when he talked about our economy being embedded within nature and not being external to it. And this, I think, is one of the fundamental flaws with HS2, is that it's not captured natural capital in the way that it should have done. And just going back to the carbon figures, Estelle mentioned the embedded carbon, we know because HS2 have underestimated their impacts to nature, they will have underestimated the amount of embedded carbon that's going to be released. That's a given. So clearly those calculations on carbon emissions need to be redone at the moment. But yeah, we're Cheshire, I'm personally all in favour of sustainable transport, but it's just the way that the project is being done. We can't let this happen again. We can do it properly. We should have done this project properly. The trouble is it's based on policies and strategic goals that were put in place 10, 15 years ago, and we didn't have the knowledge that we have today, and we didn't have those ecosystem ecological networks mapped, which shortly we will do, and we'll know how to do it properly in the future. So maybe HS2, if it could be put on ice for 10 years, come back 10 years in the future, perhaps our ecosystems won't be as fragile, and they might have some resilience to be able to cope with the impacts of a large scheme like this. But it's
so Phil, let me come to you. Thank you, Rachel. Let me come to you, because I want to sort of get past just the discussion of HS2 actually, and think, well, what do we learn from other major infrastructure projects in the future? Because clearly, not just being in favour of something in principle is enough. We've got to work out how to do these projects better in practice. I'm thinking, say, of offshore wind, where we need obviously renewable energy, but quite a lot of offshore wind is being done in a way that harms marine biodiversity. What's your sense to Tom Beeston's question about the broken system? How can we make sure we do major infrastructure well as opposed to badly? What's your sense of that?
I don't know. I mean, focusing on advising how things can be done well instead of fighting against things that aren't perfect, I think, is a large part of the problem, or a large part of the solution. I mean, we can't wait until we've got a perfect government to start building climate solutions. We can't wait until the climate is fixed to start building climate solutions. There will be damage with anything, right? In the past, conservation groups have been against solar panels, they've been against wind turbines, they've been against all climate solutions because they have impacts. Wind turbines kill birds. But the wildlife groups working with wind turbines have managed to help plot the migratory paths of various different birds and get those wind turbines out of the way of those birds. There's technical people working on AI recognition of incoming birds, so they can kind of slow down the turbines or stop them from having as many bird strikes. I think collaborating with people on moving the routes, making them better, all of these things are useful, and I've been really happy to see the Wildlife Trust and the Woodland Trust working with HS2 to try and make them do a better job. But I can't imagine what help waiting 10 years would provide, or slowing it down or even pausing it. If we need to improve our accounting for mitigation, then we can do that while we're building it. We can add more field trees later,
David, I saw you reacting a little bit there.
Yeah, I don't know why you always ask me to talk after Phil. I don't want to attack Phil. No, it's the bird wind turbine thing. Windows kill birds. They fly into windows. There's lots of bird strike going on. Things are going to kill birds. The bottom line isn't we should build these big things now and spend £100 billion north of it. It's if you want to make our infrastructure greener and better, start smaller, go a bit slower, be more considered, think about more things. Don't just go, great, let's get this done whilst we're thinking. Because anyone who's ever tried to refurbish a house or build a barn or, I don't know, tar a narrow boat knows that to go slower is more efficient in the long run. Like, let's get local rail services working more efficiently. Let's get a bus network to local communities working in such a way that people want to use them, because they can use them, because they get them to somewhere where they want to go at the time they want to get there. There's so much more that can be done rather than just, well, who knows where HS2 is actually going to go to end. If you want to go from West London to Crewe, then you're going to be very lucky.
Phil, I'll come back to you in a bit, don't worry. But indeed, David, let's get our rural broadband working properly as well. That would be another thing that'd be good to do. Loads of comments coming in. Nina Smith has said, "Are HS2 Limited the worst enemy of the concept of high-speed rail?" Interesting point. Juan El Motto said, "I liked the green for high-speed 2 guy's attitude. What's happened has happened, and we need to focus on what will happen tomorrow. Very much spilt milk and all that," smiley face. Archie has said, "If we want to save the planet, we should be making air travel less convenient and more expensive. We're doing the opposite in linking airports via HS2. Joanne Glynn has said, "Estelle mentioned that HS2 might learn from their mistakes, but surely there needs to be a change in policy and possibly reverse the build mentality." Nina Smith has said, "We need high-speed rail connectivity between Leeds and Birmingham on the right route." Anthony Powell said, "There's a saying, the best way to get where you're going is to be there already. During lockdown, the prime jobs were the work from home ones. Level up, more local jobs." Still quite a range of views there in this debate tonight.
Sorry, did you say?
Yes, for you as well. Just reflecting on some of those comments.
Yeah. No, well, I think it's entirely right, isn't it? I mean, everybody's looking through this through a slightly different lens. We're all sat here with our kind of opinions about stuff, so I'm not surprised one bit at the comments. But you know, to me, this just keeps coming back to, I guess, back to the future in a way. So the question that, you know, kind of was reflecting what I'd said there, this is about future planning. It is about future policy. And at the moment, I have no faith in the current government, and I worry about future governments to get this right. And we constantly talk about mitigation all the time, you know, to Adam's point earlier on. And it's, you know, it's the avoidance. It's actually, with these sorts of schemes, it's like, it's not taking nature out from the beginning. You know, let's start on that premise. It's like, let's build around nature if we've got to do it. And if we have to, if there's an element of destruction, let's plan for it effectively. So I think that there probably is more of a win-win here than we think. But it's just, we've got a government that's fighting itself. You know, we're saying the public purse has said it's really bad value for money, and the government held its hands up and said, yeah, no, we know that, but carried on with it anyway. So, I mean, it's just completely extraordinary. It really is. But I totally accept going to be lots of different views on this.
Let me just go back to the issue about speed versus capacity in a way, because it is at heart of this debate is a little bit the Pete Johnson said, as a reacted to a comment I made, and said we can't seriously expand local rail without clearing major bottlenecks at key hub stations, and that's what HS2 does. But there's an interesting point here, isn't there? If it's about, you know, speed was the reason that was given why the route had to be so straight and why it's ended up going through so many ancient woodlands and other sites. If actually it's about capacity more than speed, it could be a little bit slower. It could still be high speed, but not the super high speed that HS2 will be. And it could therefore bend a little and not be quite so devastating for nature. Wouldn't that be right, Phil?
I don't think the speed makes too much difference to the route design. A lot of it is simply, you know, cost gets astronomical, and the more you start bending, the more you start hitting other stuff. The more farmland that we're sneaking through and impacting food production, the more little bits of woodland we're hitting in other places. There are, if you look at the list of ancient woodlands that are being hit, the photographs that you always see being shared are of Cubbington or of these, you know, larger woodlands. But a lot of them are 0.1 hectares big. That's pretty tiny. And those little fragments of woodlands are scattered across the countryside. So the more you start snaking about, the more emissions you're going to cause by digging, the more steel and cement needed, the more little bits of woodland and drainage ditches and hedgerows and field trees and every single bit of habitat you're going to hit. So massively increasing the footprint doesn't help the situation.
Rachel, you were shaking your head at that, and I want to come to you rather than David after Phil this time.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I am going to quote something that I heard the Woodland Trust say and about the ancient woodlands, and one analogy that they used, and I'm sorry to repeat this, Adam, is that it's a little bit like going into the National Portrait Gallery and just cutting a tiny little corner off every picture. Oh, it doesn't matter, it's only a tiny little bit. We wouldn't dream of doing that. So why are we doing it to our most precious wildlife sites in the country? Why? It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up.
There you are, Adam. You can take that as a massive credit that
Craig, can I just come in there and make
your best lines? Go on, Estelle.
Yeah, I mean, you refer to these sort of tiny little sites and sort of fragments and stuff, and it's like, yeah, okay, so we just look at what we've done as humans to our countryside, and we have ended up with an incredibly fragmented landscape. You know, these sites that used to be joined together have just been cut, and actually, yeah, fragments left all over the place. I mean, you know, what good are they for nature now if it's just little bits of pockets over here, there, and everywhere? These sites need to be connected. We need to be investing in nature and reconnecting these sites, learning to farm and live, produce food, you know, with nature, build with nature, not just think it's okay to cut it down continually.
Okay, look, we're fast running out of track for this evening's discussion, I'm afraid. I'm going to go to the panel all for a final comment now. I told you time will go quickly, and it really has, hasn't it? And I'm going to ask you, each of you in turn, just a quick 30 seconds on what needs to happen now. I'll come to you in a moment. But before that, I want to come to you at home. We're going to have another poll, or in fact, more to the point, we're going to have the same poll. So I'll ask the same question again as we did at the start of tonight's Wildlife. Do you think green groups should support HS2? It's a yes, no, or not sure. We'd love to know. So the poll is appearing in the chat now. Please answer. And while that's happening, I'm going to ask what needs to happen now. Adam, can I start with you first, please?
Crumbs. Okay, right. My 10-second answer is to get
30
HS2,
seconds if you like.
Okay, HS2 to include field trees in their no net loss calcs, as like that seems like a really straightforward step that they could do tomorrow. So that's my quick one. 10 years ago, the Wildlife Trust published a report on a greener vision for HS2, setting out this idea of a green ribbon stretching from London up to Birmingham, you know, rewilded land, like totally a major green infrastructure project. So we've had the vision, had the kind of ideas. So that's the long-term stuff. But can we please start with the field trees and the hedgerow trees that HS2 have missed out of their no net loss calcs? Get them in. That's it.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Estelle, what needs to happen now?
Well, I mean, I completely disagree with what Adam said, and what the Wildlife Trusts have been calling for. You know, we've really got to take this moment just to seriously stop and pause and think about the implications and what this means for the future. And if this is a scheme that's going to be held up as an exemplar, heaven help us for the future. So we've got to get this right, and we've got to hold governments' feet to the fire. You know, we've got new legislation coming at us down the road, and yet we're undermining it constantly. So let's just stop, let's get it right, and actually, you know, it could be a really big, good green project.
Okay, Estelle, thank you. Phil, you heard that? It could be a good green project from Estelle. Phil, tell us what needs to happen now.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, absolutely. And I think one brilliant next step, I mean, I'm going to go out to a lot of the sites and check up on how things are going. I've been offered to meet with HS2 Limited, so I can kind of do an independent look over how things are coming along. And I would love to extend an invitation to the Wildlife Trust to come and meet Greens for HS2 to discuss why things like we can't just upgrade our way out of it. There's a lot of different transportation policy things that we could discuss that have been talked about here, like the fact that we already spend 3 times more on upgrading our existing railway than we do on HS2 every year. So if you guys would like to talk to us about that, we're happy to talk anytime.
Thanks, Phil. I'm sure we're happy to talk. Always happy to talk. Rachel, what needs to happen now?
Well, we'd certainly want to see HS2 putting out the right information. So doing their calculations again, making sure the mapping is done correctly. And most importantly is measuring biodiversity using a recognised method, not one that they've essentially made up themselves. And so then HS2 can be compared like for like with other projects. So getting those figures right, and then when those figures, the correct figures, are in the public domain, we can have this discussion again. We can think about, is the price that we pay in terms of the environmental cost worth the benefits? But until we have the truth in terms of the actual impacts, we can't even get into that space really, because we haven't got the full facts. And again, just going back to those carbon emissions, doing the nature calculations should inform those carbon calculations, and we know it hasn't. So let's get those calculations right.
Okay, Rachel, thank you very much. David, sorry, I'm giggling because I've just seen the results of the poll, which I'll show you in a minute. David, what needs to happen next?
Everything that we've just heard, with the exception of what Phil said, sorry. But I don't know, let's take a pause, let's stop, readdress how the project is being implemented, and maybe strip HS2 Limited's PR department budget and spend that money to create a new wetland centre.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Oh, I like that, David. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Okay. We asked you, we had the poll earlier at the start of the programme and at the end of the programme. And the question was, do you think green groups should support HS2? At the start of the programme, 12% of you said yes. Now, 15% of you said yes. So, Phil, you can take that as you've increased your support by 3%. However, the reason I was giggling is at the start of the programme, 60% said no, green groups should not support HS2, and now 69% say no. So the people opposed to HS2 has increased by 9%, and it's the not sures that have gone from 26% to 15%. And the number of participants is pretty much the same, only one difference. So I would interpret that to mean our audience has become more polarised during this discussion, when actually what we were trying to do is make things a little bit less polarised, which is interesting. So anyway, that just shows what an interesting topic this is. But thank you so much for all of you participating in this discussion tonight. I want to say, if you are one of those people, if you're one of that 69% that think green groups should oppose HS2, you might be interested to sign the open letter to HS2 that the Wildlife Trusts are currently promoting, calling for a pause and a rethink of HS2 and reconsider the way in which they're trying to look at compensating for loss of nature along the route and various other issues. So a link to that action will be in the chat shortly if it's not been already. We have other wildlife coming up right across this year, some very exciting ones as well, again out on location for many of them as well. So if you've enjoyed it tonight, do make sure you subscribe to the Wildlife Trust YouTube channel and click like and ask for notifications as well, so that you know when the next wildlife is taking place. And you can get future updates of all kind of live streams from the Wildlife Trusts and our many other videos that go out on the YouTube channel, so you know what's going on. But I want to finish tonight by saying a huge thank you to our panel, to Estelle Bailey, Chief Executive of Bebout Wildlife Trust, to Rachel Giles from Cheshire Wildlife Trust, to Adam Cormack from Woodland Trust, to Phil Sturgeon from Greens4HS2, and David Oakes, actor and podcaster. Thank you so much for coming together. It's been a fantastic discussion tonight. We might not have all got to the same place. We didn't necessarily think we would, but I hope it's been a real interest to you at home and you've all learnt something new tonight, even if we haven't necessarily completely figured out consensus way forward. I think the thing I would emphasise on this tonight, this is important to get right for HS2, but you know it's important to get right for all major infrastructure as well. I would say I don't think it's enough in the 21st century for environmentalists just to support things in principle. and practice as well, to be able to support how they're done on the ground. And we might support certain technologies and certain approaches, but they've got to be done right as well on the ground. This is about rolling our sleeves up and getting it right. And it's going beyond just the arguing for or against something, but actually making sure that when something is done, it's done in the right way and it's done sustainably. So at the Wildlife Trust, that's why we, along with other organisations like the Woodland Trust and so on, work so hard to try and reduce the damage that's being caused by HS2. And also, of course, why we oppose so many road projects across the country that are being done appallingly and cutting through wildlife spaces as well. We've got to get major infrastructure right. And more to the point, just as David was saying earlier, we've got to reduce the demand perhaps for some of those major infrastructures by changing the way we live, perhaps travelling a bit less, perhaps doing more by broadband as well. And when you think about it, tonight's wildlife is something that not long ago would have been an event where perhaps 300, 400 of us got together in a hall. Tonight we're all doing it from home without having to travel anywhere. So you never know. This tonight is an indication also about a certain form of progress. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thanks to the panel again. See you at the next one. Good night.